This is It's Not In Your Head podcast with Dan and Jez. Dan is a doctor and Justine a pain coach. We've come together to find ways to manage complex chronic pain better for both patients and providers.
So today, this episode piggybacks off the therapeutic limitations episode. And this we've termed diagnostic limitations. I've tried to make it a little bit more interesting so that we can talk through a little bit of the history and try and understand it. We're not going to get into the math of it. So if you look at how you diagnose somebody and you start doing the maths around it.
Like odds and percentages.
Odds and percentages. It's got to do with how common is this, the diagnosis you're looking for in the total population. And then when you see that individual, what's the likelihood they have it beforehand? Right. So which is called pretest probability. And, prevalence, pretest probability then influence like your,
genetic
diagnostic
background.
likelihood. Yeah. And there's so much stuff that from a mathematical perspective affects the likelihood that you can have a diagnosis. Right. But that is like really boring. So we're not really going to talk about that. Though we might talk about it at some point in time because it does create more of an understanding about how people, have and don't have diagnoses, and then the likelihood that you actually have the diagnosis, although all the tests are negative. So that's then, anyway, it's complicated.
Another oddity.
That's a whole, we'll get someone who's smarter than me. Maybe Jazz, you can explain it because you're smarter than both of us. Well, me. Okay.
I'm street smart. I joke, Dan. So I'm more street smart. Life experience heavy.
You are. That's not true. Okay. Maybe the street smart's true, but you're still out of control smart. So what we're actually going to talk about is we're going to talk about the limitations around coming to a diagnosis and how that's influenced. What we're trying to do a lot of the time is we're trying to explain vague symptoms that are confusing, make no sense, don't point to anything in particular. And what doctors and clinicians are doing are creating a structure for them to work through these difficult things to work out. And so what it does, it gives you a means of then treating the patient, which is effectively what we're trying to do. However, it comes with a bunch of unintended consequences, which we'll go through for what's happened over history, at least components of it, because there's so much of it you can't actually, we could do it in one podcast, but we'll be here for 3 hours. The other thing that we're trying to do is we're trying to do no harm. So like if there's anything that you get taught at medical school for first, it is do no harm. And like that is the basis of like all medical practice. Right. And so it's always in the back of your head. And, the do no harm piece within this situation when you're talking about diagnosing people has got to do with doing tons of investigations. And so those investigations go from being, simple blood tests and maybe getting people to fill out forms all the way through to, surgical procedures where people are getting, diagnostic laparoscopies, and we're going to go have a look and see what we can find, like that sort of stuff, which doesn't have as much there anymore. And so all those things can have significant consequences for the patient. And so you're balancing up this whole do no harm piece. And then the last piece you're balancing up is finances and resources. They're limited, whether they be personal resources in your own cash, whether it be insurers' resources. And look, they make tons of money, but nonetheless, they still have limited resources. And then government resources, depending on where you are. So Medicare, interesting's Medicare in Australia and Medicare in the US. So it's kind of the same thing. And the government actually paying for investigations and treatment, hey, like their resources are limited as well. And so it's a difficult balance between the two. Over history, there's been this approach where, you shouldn't like investigate and go after everything too much. And then there's the flip there. And then the flip has been, okay, what happens then is that then gets shifted to, well, this is then due to different things that are taking place now. And those different things that are taking place have at times been witches, demons, like a whole stack.
It depends how far back you go in history.
Yeah. We'll go through all that stuff. But what I wanted to start with, this was sort of interesting. So when you've got those two opposing approaches, number one, investigate, try and find it, treat a whole bunch of stuff.
But don't waste resources, don't hurt the patient.
Yeah. Or on the other side, bail out early, and then as it's structured at the moment, then go, well, this is a psychological issue, treat it as a psychological issue. And it was interesting. And so on the way through, I am reading like a bazillion papers on this. I'll read through some of the things. So this is from the doctor side perspective about what happens. And I think that this is real. And I don't think this is real. This is definitely real. This is kind of me preaching / quoting. So this is the doctor. The doctor initially meets the patient with enthusiasm to diagnose the issue. But as investigations are unfruitful and symptoms change, as they do, because it's a fluid state, this enthusiasm gives way to frustration and helplessness. Now, that is true. Like, right. You know, you're working through and you're going, starting to get frustrated. The physician's also likely to experience guilt over the inability to help the patient. Oh my God, that's true.
Yeah.
And a sense of incompetence for being unable to diagnose them. They also get a sense of guilt over the expenses which the patient has incurred. Okay. And that's all those things are true. Point. And I have those conversations with people all the time. Like, okay, this is where we're at. Are you comfortable? We want to go down this track. I see this a lot of time with getting an MRI. Hey, Dan, should we get another MRI? And I'm like, well, here's the thing. For me, I'll get it. Like, if I'm going to get an MRI, it's going to be because it's going to change my decision-making process.
Right. Does it affect the treatment process?
Yeah. Does it affect the treatment process? Does it affect the decision-making process? And in this setting, a lot of the time, like, it doesn't. And so let's not waste your money on it. You know, we can get an MRI, but I'm still going to do a diagnostic block. So let's just do the diagnostic block and we'll get the same information in the moment.
And even that, Dan, even that tiny snippet of context and explanation for a patient, for example, is really important and alleviates anger, frustration, anxiety when sometimes the way it's communicated is just no, or we don't need that. And there's a lack of understanding around why actually, which is hard then.
So this is I really like this next piece. So the doctor then gets a reaction formation. Okay, so that's a psychiatric term. So reaction formation is a defense mechanism where the person unconsciously replaces an unwanted or anxiety-provoking impulse with its opposite, often expressed in an exaggerated way. So the easiest way to understand that, it's the young child that's got a crush on the girl. So it's the young boy who's got a crush on the girl who doesn't know how to deal with it. And so what he does,
kicks her. Yeah.
He picks it or he kicks it. That's it.
throws rocks.
Throws rocks at it. That's it. Yeah. So that's a reaction formation. He's got a romantic feeling and he's going like, what the hell am I going to do with this? Rocks.
Rocks.
Yeah. So
start pelting patients with rocks.
So what happens from a medical perspective? So for that relationship with the patient is that the reaction formation is that the doctor starts seeing the patient as a malingerer. Right. So not as somebody that has got something legitimately wrong, who is eating up valuable time, using up limited medical resources unnecessarily. You can see that happens all the time.
Yes. And this is the piece, patients experience over and over is that shift. And I think if you understand this piece that Dan just explained, as painful and not okay, and as much as this, this is not a way to then proceed as far as it works for the patient, you can have a bit of empathy for that process and that frustration on the physician end. And nobody likes saying, I don't know, or, I can't help you even. And sometimes it's even easier to say it's psychological, right? Or you're kind of creating it rather than I can't do my job, because that doesn't feel good.
No. Yeah, absolutely. So patient side, this is from the same paper. The patient feels betrayed. They lose trust in the doctor-patient relationship. And then they might start to accuse the doctor of forcing unnecessary investigations or having alternative motives. And so that's out of this one paper. And it's like, it's kind of like... Right.
It's the full kind of circle.
Like it's the full circle. And their argument is that this comes from a process where you go, okay, I'm going to investigate and I'm going to chase this down and we're going to find out. But then when you can't,
then it's what do you do, right?
Yeah. So their proposed solution, this was directly from it. Their proposed solution. If the physician can understand that these disorders are a result of abnormal processing and perception of signals in the central nervous system, it may help not only them, but also the patients or their worried relatives to make sense of the baffling presentation.
Yeah.
So what they're doing is they're saying, okay, instead of investigating and look for a physiological cause, Then what we move to is the brain
Abnormal.
is is a prediction generator model, and it's now perceiving things. It's now
Incorrectly.
incorrectly.
Right. It's a
And
different way of saying it's in your head or it's the patient's fault.
exactly.
So it's like it came out. That's why it came out very squeaky. I was like, yeah. If you listen to the recording.
But that's the point. So they've gone from, well, if you approach them physiologically,
Right.
it creates betrayal, loss of patient relationship.
That
and
definitely doesn't work. Right.
And the doctor gets accused of doing stuff bad. But what you should do is the solution is to then say, well, actually, it's a misperception of signals. Well, no.
And even that definition, to kind of put a pin on this paper, it's well intended, right? This comes from a good place. You can tell that the author is trying to actually solve a problem. The problem is they create another problem in the solving of a worse way of explaining it. So you're not crazy, but it's in your head isn't great either.
Yeah. Okay. So now we go to the juxtaposed position, which is, and I'm going to read two things. And I loved both of these things out of this paper. So this paper is from Katz. It's 2015. It's called Chronic Pain, Psychopathology, and DSM-5 Somatic Symptom Disorder. It's a really interesting read. So, and this is, I just pulled this bit straight out of the abstract. So chronic pain that is severe and intractable has detrimental consequences, including psychological distress, job loss, social isolation, and not surprisingly, it is highly comorbid with depression and anxiety. Historically, pain without an apparent anatomical or neurophysiological origin was labeled as psychopathological. This approach is damaging to the patient and provider alike. It pollutes the therapeutic relationship by introducing an element of mutual distrust, as well as implicit, if not explicit, blame. It is demoralizing to the patient who feels at fault, disbelieved, and alone. Moreover, many medically unexplained pains are now understood to involve an interplay between peripheral and central neurophysiological mechanisms that have gone AWOL. So, yeah, I know. So I, of course, like we both feel comfortable with this, but they're arguing exactly the same thing. Like they're arguing that okay. So one group says if you go down the track of doing it physiologically, you lose it with patients with difficult to explain symptoms. You get loss of trust, breakdown of the therapeutic relationship, and blame. Okay. And so these guys are arguing, well, if you label it as psychopathology, you get distrust, blame, breakdown of therapy. It's the same it's the same argument. Like it's kind of like, okay. So the other paragraph out of this that I wanted to read, because this is from a book called Pain, the Science of Suffering by a professor called Patrick Wall in 2000. Yeah. He used to be the professor at St. Thomas's Hospital Medical School in the UK. I believe he's passed away now. I think he wrote about 4 books, which I think I might trawl my way through. This is one of his quotes out of this. There are many pains whose cause is not known. If a diligent search has been made in the periphery and no cause is found, we have seen that clinicians act as though there was only one alternative. They blame faulty thinking, which for many classically thinking doctors is the same as saying that there is no cause or even no disease. They ignore a century's work on disorders of the spinal cord and brainstem and target the mind. These are the doctors who repeat again and again to the Second World War amputee in pain that there is nothing wrong with them and that all is in their head. Like, yes, we do agree. Thank you, Professor Wall. The key point out of that, like for me, is they ignore centuries of work on disorders of the spinal cord, brainstem, and target the mind.
Right. It's not that there isn't evidence for these processes not being mind manufactured. And the plight of patients is not even only being talked about by patients. I mean, it's in these papers. So to suggest sort of even that patients' feelings and these types of attitudes that unfortunately we develop, and then I end up talking with people where how do you fix the trust between patients and why would they ever go back to the traditional medical system and typical pain consultants when they've been made to feel the way, this paragraph reads basically. but it doesn't have to be approached this way. There are better ways.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
we hope there's better ways. Well,
Well,
hopefully we'll
right.
come through with some better ways.
But what a lot of, these types of paragraphs, and as we go through the different papers too, reflect is where were we at given the time period also, and
Yes.
how that's changed over time. And that's what we'll talk through too, is basically how does this story and what hysteria has been explained as and perceived to be, and different types of diseases that get put in those sort of buckets, they do change the definition of them and how they're viewed. When it used to be completely in your head, and then you can see over time there is some shift. So
yeah, we obviously come in at a point in time in history where we have like that centuries of science behind us. So we can make certain statements and we have certain experience that, sets our mindset about how we think pain works. I was trying to think, how do you come up with an approach that, what we're saying here is that both approaches result in the same outcome. So that says to me that
neither works
neither
very
works.
well alone, right? Neither on its own in an extreme fashion works very well.
Yeah. And like, how do you then change that? It got me thinking about one of my mentors, Bruce Mitchell, who is my director of training for a period of time. And then I joined him when I was at Metro Pain Group. And I would hear Bruce, when I'd sit in with him sometimes, is just say, I don't know. And that's actually really hard to say. To be able to say to a patient, I don't know, comes with a substantial amount of humility from a doctor perspective. And when I realized how much power that had on his side, because Bruce is retired now, but Bruce's patients absolutely loved him. And I think that the ability to say, I don't know, at least gives this, you start with a point of honesty. You sit there and go, well, I actually don't know what's causing this. Now, that's going to unnerve a bunch of patients.
It's probably where the hesitation then comes from, right, Dan, from a doctor perspective, because some people will judge that. Almost.
Absolutely. What I think I found now is that people that are not comfortable with their doctor not knowing or being honest about because if you actually talk to most of us, a lot of the time we don't know what's going on. We just have to work it out.
You're doing the best you can. Yeah.
The thing that if you say, I don't know, it has to come with a couple of caveats though. It doesn't it's not like, I don't know.
Good luck.
Good luck. We'll see how we go. It comes with a number of caveats. And I think the first caveat is, number one, I don't know, but I believe you. And that's sort of the first step. The second bit is, I don't know, but I'm comfortable this isn't going to kill you. And I know you chuckle, but that is always at the back of my mind. And if I am not comfortable, then I'm going to make myself comfortable. So, and that's when I will investigate. That's when I'll investigate relatively aggressively and quickly to go, okay, we have got to get rid of boom, 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 this, and make sure that we have not got any, acute issues here that need to be dealt with. So it comes with that. I don't know, but I'm comfortable. It's not going to kill you. And by the way, if I'm not going to do that, I'm going to do this. And it has to come with the ability to generate a plan. So you can say, I don't know, but this is how we're going to work it out. And if you can't generate a plan that's realistic, has limits on it, then you're not going to be able to generate any confidence from the patient. And so a lot of the time when I'll see a patient, I will say, okay, I'm not 100% sure what it is. However, it is probably going to be this. It might be this. And if I need to, I'll say, and I'm going to exclude these things and I'm going to do this first. Then what we're going to do is we're going to work through it in this fashion. And so in that way, you've been able to say, hey, I'm not 100% sure, but this is how we're going to work it out together.
Right. And that's the key word, together. Right. And the patients that are super put off by, I don't know, those aren't patients who are actually trying to work it out together. They're trying to have you work it out for them typically. And a patient who is trying to have a collaborative approach and just wants to understand what's going on so you can do their part, you can do your part rather, and they can do their part. They don't mind that as much. And that's probably a really good way to inadvertently, even not intentionally, select patients that have the right mindset and approach, because it takes both sides and it takes working together.
I think that what happens is that patients do self-select out. If they're not comfortable, they're like, okay, thanks.
Right.
You don't know what the hell you're talking about. Goodbye. And which is fine and reasonable. My job is to get people better. And if they don't have confidence, then they're not going to get better. So if they're not comfortable with the approach, okay, sayonara. And it's better for them.
Yeah. And it's so interesting that you found these exact two papers, or others even too, because I remember us talking on the phone a couple conversations ago and touching on that, where I was like, do you think the substitution of it's in your head comes from it's too hard to say, I don't know, and I can't figure it out? And it is.
It's part of it. It's part of it.
Right.
It's not all of it. And we'll go through the history.
No.
Like previously we would have said it was witches. So
right. No, it's the historical perspective. Yeah.
It's a historical perspective. Things. When you're diagnosing somebody, diagnosis is limited by a bunch of different things. So it's not only just limited by, the prevalence and incidence of the diagnosis within society. It's limited by the doctor's experience. It's limited by their knowledge base. It's limited by technology. And you then will make diagnoses for each individual within a limited knowledge base. And I think that's really important to understand. So the good example of that, when I was a registrar, so registrar is kind of like a resident, in the US. So when I would see somebody with lower back pain, I would know that when I'm taking history is very poor at being able to predict what is causing
actually wrong
lower back pain. I knew that examination findings were also poor. And we know that MRI findings don't match what is the underlying painful pathology. So as a registrar, I'm like, well, that's where my limits are. And so if you're in that environment, well, then what do you come up with the diagnosis? I come up with the diagnosis of non-specific lower back pain because I don't actually have the ability to go further. And so the majority of the world is in that position. So they're in the position where, like, if you're a physiotherapist or a physical therapist in the US, or you're a chiropractor, or you're an osteopath, or you're a PCP,
like an athletic trainer, even almost.
Whatever. All that stuff, you are limited with your ability to take a history, which is poor. The information you get from examination, which is poor. And most people don't even have access to scans. Right. And so, of course, the diagnosis becomes not specific lower back pain. So
reflects the diagnostic limitations. The diagnosis reflects the diagnostic limitations.
Yeah. Now, for me, I then went on to learn how to do diagnostic injections, then diagnostic blocks, and then therapeutic procedures that then treat individual structures within the lumbar spine. And so for me, these days, lumbar spine's got 5 major causes, which causes 98% worth of pain. So that's facet joints, sacroiliac joints, hips, discs, and nerves. And so I can work through the process of now blocking the nerves to each one of those sites. I have the additional feedback that I can then treat it. And so if I can treat it, I then get this feedback about, well, I had these things on history, these things on examination, these things in scan. This is what the diagnostic block looked like. And they're not always perfect.
Right.
And this was the therapeutic outcome. And you can then go, well, that worked really well. That gives you more of an idea. And so I haven't made the diagnosis of non-specific lower back pain for like 10 years because I have additional skill base.
Right. You have other tools.
I have other tools in the kit to be able to do it. And now if you apply that to a historical context, and then you start looking at it, you start going back a couple of thousand years.
If you thought it was bad now, just go back and it's crazy.
I think let's take it away from back pain and we just take it into a set of symptoms that you don't understand. Basically, they're confusing, they're vague, they don't make any sense. You can't, it wasn't because someone fell over and busted a leg. You can tell why that's. Yeah. What do you get? If you look in the literature, it looks like symptoms of vague, undescribed things were first described about 4,000 years ago. So it's been around forever. And then it starts to get described in about 500 years BC by Hippocrates. And so Hippocrates at that point in time describes it as hysterion, which is rather like hysteria, like hysterectomy. It's the uterus. And so they came up with this theory that it was because of the wandering uterus. This is like, okay.
You cannot make this shit up.
No, you can't make this up. I'll read, this is a quote from Arturaeus in 200 BC, so a couple of years after Hippocrates. So,
You got to read it so everyone can understand why I'm smiling, looking
all
at it
right.
ahead
So,
of time.
Arterase has thus described hysteric diseases in the 11th chapter of his work. In the middle of the flanks of a woman lies the womb and female viscus, closely resembling an animal, for it is moved of itself hither and thither. In the flanks, also upwards and in a direct line below the cartilage of the thorax, and also obliquely to the right and to the left of the liver or spleen, and it is likewise subject to prolapse downwards. In a word, it altogether is erratic and delights also in the fragrant smells. Oh my God, this is nuts. And advances towards them in a aversion to fetid smells, like bad smells, and flees from them. On the whole, it is like an animal within an animal.
God, we needed a trigger warning. We needed that. Sorry, I forgot the trigger warning before that paragraph.
Oh yeah, sorry, trigger warning. Oh my God.
Well, that makes sense. That makes sense. It's the uterus. I mean,
oh yeah, the uterus that moves all over the place
prolapse.
is attracted to nice smells and runs away from bad smells. And okay, and so for the funny thing about that is what the management strategy became is that it became centered around the smells. So what they used to do is get a bunch of bad smelling stuff and put it up and put good smelling stuff down hither and have it attract. The uterus would run away from the bad smells and go to the good smells.
They're fixing the bad positive feedback loop.
Oh my God. And so
that's right. Where we start. Yeah.
So that's one of it.
If you're still with us after that.
Oh yeah. Okay. What do you reckon the main reason for the wandering uterus was?
What?
Come on. It's pretty obvious.
Well, I don't know.
It's a bunch of men writing about why females have unwell, and it's due to the uterus. What's it got to be due to?
It's the earliest sign of, women are a bigger pain in the ass than men, and it's because of our uterus.
Yeah, but why is the uterus the problem? It's because there's not enough sex.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so
that's the treatment, right?
That is, okay, right. The treatment is, and the treatment, this treatment remains in place.
Men definitely came up with this treatment.
This treatment remains placed through to the 1900s. Even Freud is like, more okay, sex. What you have to do is get married, have sex, and more babies, and that will fix the whole problem.
That will fix the problem. There's no bias in this.
Yeah. So Plato termed it the sad uterus when it wasn't having enough sex.
Oh
my God. Anyway.
The syndrome called the sad uterus leads to a bunch of vague symptoms.
Thanks to the Greeks. And interestingly, that remains really strong for the next 2,000 years. There's a couple of things that then happen is sort of the uterus remains pretty strong throughout history.
Post uterus.
And remains one of the major causes up until the 1800s. However, there's different other causes along the way. So demons is early. So demon possession is a big one. So Jesus gets a first look in, and I think it's Mark 5, 1-20. So Jesus cast out the demon from the man in the cemetery into a herd of pigs, but it's actually a herd of swine that then ran off a cliff. Makes sense. Demons there.
It's either demons, uteri, witches.
Yeah. So witches. So witchcraft comes in around the 1400s, and it's a church doctrine called Hammer of Witches, the Malleus Maleficarum. It's written in 1486. So although this book is not church doctrine as such, it certainly is taken on as doctrine. And essentially, it's a doctrine that says that there's the existence of demons and witches. And of course, if you're not convinced by the doctrine or by the book, that's because you're a victim of the devil. And
you are a witch.
You are a witch. It's there. And so how it worked at that point in time is that if the physician couldn't identify a problem or a disease, it was then due to the devil or to witchcraft.
I mean, back then it was because of the devil, and because now it's misinterpretation of a signal, right? But it's the same sort of the piece that we can't figure out well and explain since the beginning of time has been attributed to different sort of explanations.
Yeah. So then during the 1500s, so post 1400, you then start getting the uterus gets a resurgence.
Yeah, the uterus makes a comeback.
The uterus rates come back as the major problem, but then you get a couple of other people that come in. So they're looking for more inverted commas scientific reasons, and so it's sort of during the 1500s that the witch hunts start to become condemned, and they're sort of like, yeah, we're not so good at burning all these people at
I don't know about
stake,
this.
but they shift it so it's no longer witchcraft, but it's now sorcery. Okay, and it's
less violent, maybe.
Well, I don't know. Maybe what's the difference between witchcraft and sorcery? Like a male sorcerers and I don't know. Anyway,
just the stake burning.
Yeah. So we're not so cool with the stake burning, and it's then becomes due to sorcery and marginality. This was sort of Giuliano Cardano. So he's 1501 to 1576. What he hypothesized, and marginality refers to a body of water. It's like it's the edge of it. It's like it's being close to a body of water. And so he hypothesizes that it was fumes and polluted water. Not a bad guess. And then further down the track, around the same sort of period of time, towards the end of the 1500s, Giovanni Battista della Porta, he proffered that it was due to substances that produced visions and pictures. Also, not an unreasonable guess. So as we're sort of moving through history, so what you've got there is we've got this thing that the doctor can't work it out. It's demons. The doctor can't work it out. It's witches.
Your uterus.
The doctors can't work it out. It's fumes or polluted water. So now we're starting to get somewhere. Or the doctor can't work it out. It's substance abuse. Not bad. Like we're starting to get there. Okay, so
it's getting better.
It's getting better. So then we start go a little bit sideways in history for a while. And so we're back to demons in the 1700s. And so we're back to demons. And
we were doing so well.
Yeah. And exorcism. So there's Father Johann Joseph Gassner. So he basically becomes big on exorcism. He wrote a booklet which he explained his principles around his healing method. And he basically states that there's two kinds of illness, natural ones that belong to the realm of the physician and pre-natural ones. And he classified these into three categories: circumcessio, which is an imitation of a natural illness caused by the devil; obsessio, which was the effect of a sorcerer, so we're sort of just still hanging on to the 1500s; and possessio, which was overt diabolical possession by a demon, which was the least frequent of them all.
Noted to be least frequent.
What he would do is he would do essentially a trial exorcism. And so the trial exorcism would involve the patient essentially saying that they believe in Jesus and that was the essential prerequisite. And then they go on to see if he could produce the symptoms. Okay. And so if he was able to produce the symptoms from the patient, he would then say, well, this was because they are possessed by a demon or they are under the power of a sorcerer or one of the three. And so then it ends up being that Gassner sees this as if he's able to produce the symptoms, he's able to then exercise it. If no symptoms occurred, he was like, okay, this is because it's a medical problem. You're going to go see that. You got to
go see a doctor.
Go see a doctor. Right. So it's like he tried to exercise.
It's not a bad process. It's just
like during this period of time, there's still a bit of witch hunting going on, but towards the end of his period of time, or particularly during his period of time, possessions like demonic possession and witch hunting become uncool. It's the time
out of fashion.
Yeah, it becomes out of fashion. It's the period of time, what's called the Enlightenment. And they're like, yeah, we should really start killing everybody. And this whole demon possession thing doesn't make much sense.
Doesn't make sense.
And so in steps Franz Anton Mesmer. So he's 1734 to 1815. And so Mesmer, if you think of the word mesmerize, is the pre-step to hypnotism. And so Mesmer comes up with the theory of animal magnetism. And so the reason he feels that we get all these unexplainable symptoms is based on a theory that the tidal influences of the planets exert a universal magnetic force on humans. And he termed this magnetic force animal magnetism, which I kind of find this interesting. I like random fact about me. So I used to be a bouncer.
Astronomy
so I
buff?
used to do secure. Oh. No, astronomy buff. No,
I was like,
I used to be a bouncer.
way
Okay,
cooler.
so back
cooler.
in the day when I was bouncing,
It's
whenever
hilarious.
there was a full moon, everyone would be like, it's like it's always a bit.
People are
everything's
crazy.
a bit no, yeah, no.
Yeah.
But if you
It's
think
that
about the
animal
words,
magnetism.
you think about the word lunatic. So lunatic has got that
Luna.
lunar, and it's sort of
Yeah.
like this whole fair. So Mesmer's
Yeah.
tied into this
Yeah,
you know, magnetism,
tidal craziness, lunar, like yeah. I like that better than uterus demons and witches. Not quite
so
there
anyway,
yet, but
so he's basically moving down the track of this is now it's an external force.
It's external,
and
right?
It's the magnetism, and
at least it's not the patient's fault in this version. It's the solar system. Sorry.
Well, yeah, I suppose it's
kind of sweet.
Yeah. And so basically what he ends up doing is essentially the same stuff. So he is charismatic. So if you actually read through a bunch of his stuff, like this guy is super charismatic and he doesn't mind the cash. And so he's similar to Gassner, has this process where he goes through a process essentially hypnotizing people. And he realizes that he is able to bring out symptoms in people and he's able to change their symptoms. And so if he's not able to change their symptoms, then it's not due to the animal magnetism, it's due to a medical thing. And so he flicks them off to the medical thing.
Right.
So it's effectively the same thing as Gassner. And he even writes that Gassner just has a strong amount of animal magnetism and that's why his stuff works. It's not because of demons. And so he's sort of like, they've got this crossover period of time where he's
like late 1700s.
Yeah, late 1700s, where they're kind of rivals within doing the same thing. What he called if he was able to produce the symptom from the patient, he would call that a crisis. Okay. And so if he was able to produce the crisis, and then the disease would be cured. Okay. And so, as I've mentioned before, he doesn't mind the cash though. So he starts doing this in groups. And we're not talking small groups. We are talking groups of 200 or so, right? And so what he does, I can't believe
I just worked so hard to get like 10 people in a group program. I'm impressed. I'm impressed.
Okay, so this is what you need to do. So if you want to improve your group people numbers, this is a group people numbers. So what he would have 200 people come over to his house.
Oh my
200,
God. How big was his house?
That's what I thought, right? But what he'd do is he'd get this massive tub.
Oh my God.
That was about 1.5 feet high, and he'd fill it with water. And out of the tub, they've had these poles sticking out of
I don't know, man.
So it's like
kosher.
It's like a kiddie pool with like a lid on it, and out of it's got these iron poles that are all pointing at different levels.
Oh my God. Yeah. It's like a sound bath, like in water.
Yeah. And then he would connect I think they connected the iron poles and the people with these ropes, and that they would then and they had mirrors around the room.
I wish there were pictures of this.
I looked for one. I couldn't find one. I just found a description. And they had mirrors around the rooms that would increase the animal magnetism.
Yeah, because you're increasing the sensory input to people who are sensitive to it.
Yeah. And what Mesmer would be doing is Mesmer would also play the glass harmonica. Okay, so a glass harmonica, it's not like a hillbilly harmonica with
the glass
that we're called. No, it's a harmonica. And what it is it came from wine glasses. Okay, so wine glasses that you fill up with different things.
Glass?
Yeah.
Yes,
you do that.
yes,
so,
yes. Mm-hmm.
But what you do with this is that they actually put them into a spinny thing, and you can actually, if you get online, you Google it, you can look up glass harmonica, and you can see what it sounds like. But pretty much, if you can see this guy with the big water, people connected by ropes, mirrors around, and he's playing like the glass harmonica, which is like this spooky sort of music going on. Okay, like
it sounds like Burning Man. Like, I don't know what type of medical situation this is, but
yeah. So not surprisingly, he was doing like mass hypnotism effectively, and and I think they had a bunch of people. He used to have helpers that would just, when everybody whoever had a crisis,
whoever was having crises,
they just like carry them out to the next room and deal with them in the next room. So
sounds like ayahuasca.
And he's like, and he's like $200, 200 people. Who knows how much he was charging? He was like rolling in the cash. Now, to his defense, though, okay, he wasn't completely focused on the cash.
Defend the harmonica bathwater.
No, he had he had a magnetized tree. And so what he did, instead of the big tub of water, he magnetized the tree somewhere that the poor people could access.
That's nice. Way to give back.
Yeah, he's obviously an interesting character. Actually, he a number of times tried to get his approach and his theories accepted as mainstream, and all the mainstream scientific guys went, "No way, dude, you're out." Didn't stop him making a ton of cash though. So anyway,
it just made me think of, and it's kind of that similar issue where then when people go away from the traditional medical system, you will pay a bunch. And there are people who, not that he was a charlatan completely disingenuously, but that's when then you pivot to these things filling in what traditional medicine poo-poos. But if those patients have also been cast away, what options are they going to gravitate to? Harmonicas in the pool. So it's not because patients are dumb either. It's because they've tried. And I just wanted to kind of make that connection.
And I think that's it, whole being aware that if you don't go with the, hey, I'm not sure, but I'm going to try and help you, people still go looking for help. It's not like they stopped looking for help. They just stopped. They stopped going to you. Right. I always see that happen in a number of different situations where, patients they circle back over time. Like I will see a patient and then they'll go, let's give Dan a go again. And you kind of get a feel of what they've done like over that period of time in between. People don't stop. They keep on looking for answers.
So circling back to hypnotism.
So then what we come into is we start hitting hypnotism. And so it's coming, and this is the point in time where in history, we start to recognize that there's an unconscious component to the mind and a conscious component. And this is where Jean-Martin Charco is very famous within medical world. He has got a bunch of stuff named after himself. He's born 1835, lives through to 1893. He starts off like he's son of a carriage maker, but I think it sounds like the carriage maker thing. Like his dad sounds like he was pretty handy at the carriages and made a ton of cash and was obviously
really good at carriages.
Was able to put his son through medical school. But he's described as this guy who's cold, silent, shy, aloof with a speech impediment, and he's got a big black mustache. So he's a
Luigi. I'm thinking of like the Luigi.
Yeah, I'm thinking Luigi with a French accent. They're speaking French. So
an aloof Luigi.
Yeah. So he kicks off. He gets into medicine, does his thing. He's not very the first part of his career is not very exciting, but then he starts working at. I apologize to everybody who speaks French. At Saint Pétrier's Hospital. Okay,
that was perfect.
Salpêtrière is a hospital, but it's not like a little hospital down the road. It's like a city within a city. It's got 45 buildings to it. It is it's massive. It's got squares, it's got gardens, it's got churches. It really is a city within a city.
Steroids.
Yeah. So at the start, what happens is that he gets assigned to the medical poorhouse. All right. So he's like the lowly guy.
That's where you start.
That's where you start, mate. You're over there. But what he realizes is that he's got that there's a whole stack of really rare conditions there.
He gets the best patients.
And he's like, oh, this
is
guy's
fun.
gold. Yeah. He's like, this
Yeah.
is a gold mine here.
Yeah.
So this is a gold mine of medicine. And so what he ends up doing is that over a period of time, he ends up becoming the head of one of the sections of the areas. And as soon as he hits that, he's into it. So he starts doing a bunch of case series. He does autopsies on everybody, sets up on a bunch of, well, assuming they were dead. So,
somebody did. I was like, wow, he's multi-skilled.
Yeah. No, I just look at your face there. I was like, I'm
is that
sure
legal?
they're dead. So it's the 1800s. Hey. So case histories, autopsies. He sets up a bunch of laboratories. And over 8 years, he identifies a whole stack of neurological disorders. And he becomes recognized as the greatest neurologist of the time. And honestly, he still remains that. He still remains one of like the great doctors throughout that period of time that, recognized, categorized, and documented a whole stack of diseases during that period of time. At that point in time, he gets interested in this difference between epileptic and hysterical seizures. And so he writes a bunch of papers on those and gets quite renowned for being able to split between the two. And it's reading all this sort of stuff, it's interesting. It sounds like hysterical seizures, so non-epileptic seizures, are more common during this period of time than you would expect that they are now. Although, who knows, it might be just the stuff that I'm reading. I don't know. Yeah. Along the way, he gets interested in hypnotism. What he's then able to do is he picks up a bunch of tricks like mesmer. Okay, so he gets a bunch of party tricks. Okay, similar to mesmer, he realizes that he can hypnotize people, and he realizes that he's able to turn people's symptoms on, turn people's symptoms off,
manipulate the output.
So he develops this bunch of tricks, and he has a group of patients that get sent to him, and he does the whole, gets people to walk again and makes some people like able to see again and all this sort of stuff. So
not bad.
He gets pretty well known. And obviously he's going through this period where he's doing a lot of hypnotism of his hysterical patients, because that becomes what the treatment becomes.
Hypnosis
he thinks
for
that
hysteria.
This is So he's using hypnosis to access the unconscious mind to then treat these hysterical symptoms that have no explanation
otherwise.
And so we're moving away from it being the uterus to it being, now it's in the unconscious mind in that setting. However, and this is hilarious. Okay, so it appears and who knows if this is true, but it's a great story, so we're going to run with it. They may have got a little bit overzealous with use of the hypnotism. Okay, so Salpêtrière it's a big joint, all right, and people live there. It's not like they come into hospital and go home. Like they live there, they have like substantial lives, and so some of the things they have balls and they have dances and they have all that sort of stuff going on as well. And so at one of the balls, someone inadvertently rings a gong, okay, and all these patients become cataplectic,
catatonic,
so they can't move. So
insane.
So they're dancing, and then all of a sudden, someone, oops! Like you get so see it's the medical student that's going, "Hey, watch this!" Boom, and all these patients then freeze, unable to move, but they're completely awake.
How do you unfreeze them? Is there like a never mind
who knows?
command?
I assume you hit the gong again, but it sort of makes you think like, what do you need that signal within a
hard stop
therapy? What do you need a hard stop for? But you know what? Maybe what you do need a hard stop for is if you do have a bunch of patients that have got a seizure, but maybe if you've got a inverted commas we call a non-epileptic seizure, that if you can ring a bell and turn it off.
Stop it.
Maybe that's not...
All the people with FND, I mean, if you could just hit a gong and it would stop your inexplicable tremors, that wouldn't be bad.
Yeah,
it's just a little overkill.
Yeah, anyway, so it's overkill if you can like stop everybody, like the majority of people at the dance from moving.
We will not do that at the Empower You conference. Just saying. The patient Can you imagine? This is a patient ball that went awry. We won't do that.
No.
Let's preface that.
So anyway, so interestingly though, things go a little bit sideways for Charco, even though
that damaged.
Well, it's not so much that actually. What ended up happening is that Charco was probably, he was not exactly the nicest guy in the world. Okay, so
not super liked.
It basically says like he did not like being contradicted, and he would destroy the careers of anyone who did. And he was reportedly quite grumpy. All right, so that becomes a problem because as a result, no one wants to tell you you're wrong. And no one wants to give you anything that might be wrong. So what ends up happening is that his staff start feeding him patients that are going to respond the way that they want to. And not only do they give him like the right patients, but they then start training the patients.
Well, that must be nice. Dan, don't you wish you just only got the right patients and they came pre-trained?
Pre-trained to tell me everything that I want and answer yes to all my questions and show all my signs. And
give the best history.
Yeah. His research becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because
it loses credibility.
Yeah, and it starts to lose credibility, and people and other observers start to see, hang on, this is not, like there's something significantly wrong with this. And he starts to get criticized about it quite significantly. Now, that said, even though he gets discredited to a certain extent, that said, when he dies, he does get a state funeral. So he's like, yeah, this guy was awesome. However, there was also one downside to him not listening to his colleagues, which was one of them had been writing to him for like 4 years anonymously because he doesn't want to get cut. For 4 years, telling him that he's got angina. He's like, dude, you've got angina, you're gonna die. And he completely ignores this and then dies. Yeah.
Well,
there's the downside of not listening to your colleagues.
Why?
Anyway,
that's funny.
So at about the same time as everyone wiggled Juzz's.
I'm in serious wiggle time.
At about the same time as Charco, Briquette is around. So Briquette is 1959 is when he publishes a treatise on hysteria. And so Paul Briquette, he's in a similar situation to Charco in that he's a doctor. He is effectively assigned to an asylum that has got a ton of...
An embarrassment of riches.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. It's just got a ton of patients in it that have got unexplainable symptoms. And interestingly, I got the original treaty and I translated the abstract. And in the abstract, 3/4 of the abstract is him talking about how much he dislikes these type of patients. And then, and then at the end, he goes, but you know what? They're really interesting. And they actually fall into some categories. And so...
You got to admit.
but they're all right. What he does is he, over a number of years, has 430 cases that he documents. And he then brings it together. And it really starts to form the basis of what later becomes somatoform disorders with DSM, particularly DSM-3. He also starts at a point where he wants to move away from the word hysteria because he sees the term hysteria as pejorative. And he's like, it's pejorative. I don't like it. However, he says, but everybody at the moment uses it. Everybody understands it. And so I am going to use it within this treaty to describe in part what we're doing. But he does realize that at this point in time, like it's not useful and he doesn't like it, which is kind of like it's an interesting position for him to start from. So the setting in which he's working is, as I said, it's a hospital. It's Hospital de la Charité in Paris. Hospital de la Charité. I apologize for just butchering that to everybody who speaks French once again. And what he's got, and then as you read through his stuff, what you start to realize he's got a large mix of patients. You have patients that are coming in with non-epileptic seizures. They've got cardiac symptoms, they've got gastric symptoms, they've got all manner of things. So he has a mix and he starts bringing them all together over a period of time. And he starts looking at a bunch of different risk factors. So the first risk factor he identifies is gender. Okay, and he basically shows that out of all the hospital records, there's 1,000 women that are diagnosed with hysteria and 50 men diagnosed with hysteria. And essentially just from the maths, he goes, well, it's 20 times more likely that females will present with hysteria. And so the next thing that he starts to recognize is age. And so he says 1/5 of Briquette's cases occur before puberty and the majority occur before the age of 20, which I find like really interesting. So I wonder what was the population that it was seeing there. So if you see patients with hypermobile EDS, where do they present? They really present in those early teen years when I personally think that's when they're starting to get stretchier.
Yeah, and you just don't realize it often.
And you just don't realize it. And that's where people are starting to present with the dysmenorrhea, so painful periods, and they're starting to present with lightheadedness and dizziness because they're moving towards this POTS diagnosis. And then, gastrointestinal symptoms as the tease stretches, and now you've got your blob on it. So now you've got whole stack of unexplainable symptoms, and it's taking place within this context of
younger females.
Younger females. And basically he goes on to say that it's rare after the age of 30. And so, I think those numbers still kind of stand. You see, like for difficult to explain symptoms, which sits into conditions like HDDS, although I feel that we can explain that quite simply these days. They do present early, and who knows what he was actually seeing there. The other thing that he identifies as hereditary is that there's there's a genetic component to this that is getting passed on, and that, mothers were more likely to go on to have daughters that had
hysterical daughters.
Pretty much, yeah.
Makes sense.
And the numbers he puts on it is that a person born of hysterical parents are 12 times more likely to have hysteria than those born of non-hysterical parents. And so what he's identifying is that there's a hereditary component to it, and it just makes us feel uncomfortable every time we say the word hysteria.
But
yeah, and so the other things that he describes are a moral... It's a physical constitution and moral predisposition. And so what he writes is that they were extremely impressionable, very fearful, and had a great fear of being scolded. And when they choked, burst into tears, and ran away. So, okay. So the thing there is that what does that sound like? That sounds like anxiety and PTSD.
I was just going to say pain makes you fragile also, too, when you're like even an undiagnosed level.
Yeah, but I think that for me, when I'm listening to those symptoms, I'm hearing anxiety. I'm hearing, they have great fear of being scolded. Okay, that sounds like PTSD. It also sounds like an abusive relationship somewhere in the background.
Historical, yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's so he's starting to identify, okay, we've got anxiety, we've got PTSD. He basically identifies depression as well. And so he states he considered that an hysterical person experienced sorrow, that this affected the part of the brain that is the seat of feeling, which in turn influenced the body to produce hysterical symptoms. And so basically what he's saying there is he's recognizing that patients that are depressed have also got a bunch of other symptoms going on, which is accurate.
And I mean, he basically identified like pre-existing factors, right? The types of things that lead to pain. So he's right. It's hereditary, it's life experience. There's all these different components. And then you develop emotional pieces to your pain, which if you could ever explain the symptoms to begin with, you will end up more hysterical as you go along that process.
Yep. The other thing that he identifies is social class. So basically identified that lower social class was more likely to be affected by hysteria. Although at the time they thought it was the opposite.
They thought wealthier people had higher effects of hysteria.
Yeah, originally. But he says, no, it's lower.
More
And
stress,
so,
anxiety.
yeah. He describes this as mode of education, but I don't know. What he identifies here is child abuse. And so 1/3 of hysterical children in his series had been habitually maltreated or held constantly in fear or had been directed harshly by their parents. Okay,
Yeah.
so he clearly identifies there that you've got that there's
Trauma component.
there's a trauma
This is
component to these to these symptoms. And so
he's piecing it together. It's
he's
just
starting to piece it
that's
together. And interestingly,
yeah.
he identifies parents, but he also identifies ill treatment by parents or husbands,
Yeah, his
turmoil or
partners.
worries, preoccupations that arise from the marriage, family, or illicit relationship, business anxieties, and setbacks of, of change from occupational to domiciliary. And he also raises jealousy, fear, deception, and broken love affairs. So like the whole
gamut.
The whole gamut. He's going, there's an external emotional trauma component to this that is an issue. So we mentioned before that like Hippocrates was all about you just not having enough sex, and that comes through for like a ton of different years. And basically that he reverses that pretty much. And he pretty much says, look, in nuns, you never see, he said, it's very rare to see hysteria in nuns. It's more common to see it in servants and normal everyday people.
Yeah.
And he considered prostitutes to be at high risk. And interestingly, what he really identifies within that is it's not because they're having tons of sex.
It's not the sex, it's the abuse and the trauma
Exactly. Yeah. He identifies that it's the abuse and the major trauma that is behind these, these people's lives and the sex that is likely driving this. And, he writes more a result of distressing impressions, fears, and difficulties of their lives, which is like, okay,
fair.
That's
kind of
reasonable. Similarly, sort of sexual, he refers to sexual continence, which, and what he basically says here is he provided examples of cases where hysteria had been provoked by intercourse. And so is that like referencing a previous rape, a previous episode of abuse that's triggering that off? So I think he's pretty much all over the fact that, there's a ton of abuse within the background. He also recognizes that people that have had previous poor health, so that includes previous problems with migraine, abdominal pain, disturbances of appetite, and chronic malaise. So you can probably chuck a bunch of IBS symptoms in there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Illness associated with weakness, anemia, prolonged suffering predisposed to hysteria, and the chronic affections of the genital organs made more strongly than affections of other organs. What I reckon is interesting there is that is not so much what they're referring to with regards to the disease processes, but more the fact that it's a prolonged suffering. So what do we see with sensitization these days? When people are essentially sensitized, does it happen straight away? No, it actually takes time. It takes time for multiple things to gradually increase, and you then get the development of central sensitization. Yeah. Once you're getting central sensitization, you're starting to get all these other weird symptoms. So
the unexplainable stuff.
They also bring together, there's a lot of stuff that he references, child abuse, PTSD in different formats. Interestingly, they link amenorrhea, so not having periods, and dysmenorrhea, so painful periods, as being a part of this. I haven't been able to reconcile myself that that's ever in your head, but that holds true. Like they hold that stays present all the way up until that's all the way through up until 2013, which is which is interesting. So So, couple of symptoms he starts to recognize. So, you've got these predisposing factors. You've then got a group of symptoms. Some symptoms are pain in the epigastrium, pain in the left side of the chest, pain in the left side of the vertebral column are never absent. He had this left-sided thing he had going on. So he pretty much reckoned that you're more likely to get left-sided presentations rather than right-sided presentations. I don't know how that's panned out.
Yeah, it's like, why would that be?
I don't know. I'll have to. There's some people that say that gets held up. I've never heard of that ever since. They also have this setting of hyperesthesias, so hypersensitivity, anesthesias, so loss of sensations. So you can't smell, can't feel, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Seizures, paralysis, muscle contraction, respiratory and abnormal secretions. And so each one of these things then starts to look like other components. So these days, the gastric symptoms.
This would be split out into a million specialties, like his list in and of itself.
So this is now getting split out. And this is where he's seeing lots of different things in the same things. He describes pain in the muscles is also common, that there is no single woman with this neurosis who does not have some muscle pain during the course of the illness. So that's fibro.
Makes sense. Yeah, exactly. Widespread body pain.
Yeah. And so the aesthesias. It's pretty much, that's, what we would consider sort of just nociceptive sensitization. He also goes through anesthesias. So that's loss of feeling. So that includes around your mouth, sense organs, particularly blindness and deafness. And this is where we're starting to get into, we're getting this crossover between, these are then looking at functional neurological disorders is where they've where they've gone towards, which is the, functional blindness, functional deafness, and also the same with paralysis, where he's seeing patients that have got, paralysis that they can't identify a cause for, and it might be just one arm, or it might be one leg, or it might be, it might be paraplegia. He's seeing that as hysterical paralysis is what he's seeing in that setting. He's also got the non-epileptic seizures, which sounds like they were more common at the time, certainly common in that setting. And what they've got is not only, he's trying to tease out between epileptic seizures and non-epileptic seizures, but what they see with where they are is that they get a behavioral component of it. So if one patient has got non-epileptic seizures, other patients start to have non-epileptic seizures. So they do get this crossover where they've got a behavioral component taking place within the hospital as well. And so, you do see that sort of stuff is not particularly new. He describes also circulatory stuff, so palpitations, chest pain, and genitourinary pain, so pain on urination, etc., that he sees as symptoms that are hysterical. And look, we can keep on sort of running through his stuff, but I suppose the point about what he's done is he's gone through a process of breaking it down to a set of symptoms that are overlapping with these patients. He's put them into different buckets. He's identified a series of risk factors and then come up with essentially a categorization type approach. The other thing that he recognizes is that it has major social implications. It has social implications for the patient and it has social implications for their family. When this is written, I think there's another paper that we went through on this, where those social implications are written as blame. It's a blame, this is
the connotation.
Yeah. So it goes, this is in their head. So it's hysterical. It's in their head. The social implications are then their fault. So there's then the whole blame piece that goes around it, which I don't think he really focuses on it from that perspective. What he's saying is that, okay, there's all this stuff going on, and guess what? There's a bunch of social implications for these people, and so we need to be able to manage it.
He's not really attaching judgment to that fact. It's just, it exists.
It's just a fact that, what I think you see with a bunch of other stuff is you see, blame because
it's on you.
And it's on you. Like, this is your fault. It's on you. Anyway, so he's writing this around 1859. So then
it's not bad for 1859.
Yeah, no, he's done a pretty good job to bring that all together. So what ends up happening after that is that Charco comes in, and then we're getting to the end of the 1800s. The uterus is getting its last
gasp.
Its last gasp of being what's the problem. And this is where Swedish Army Major Thurbrandt, okay, so Thurbrandt, late 1800s, he's a gynecologist. He sticks with the theory that it's the uterus. And what he does is he prescribes uterine massage for this.
Everything.
And if you're thinking about what uterine massage is, you're probably thinking correctly. This becomes pretty popular at the time. And he's got, if you read around the stuff, it says he has 5 different clinics running.
Look, this is the beginning of pelvic health. This is early pelvic peak.
Yeah, that's it. He's got doctors working for him. He's got physiotherapists working for him. And, it gets picked up by the French. It gets picked up by multiple other things. There's a paper published in I think it's 1895 about the Thurbrandt method. And not surprisingly, over a period of time, this kind of falls out of favor because of this.
Becomes awkward.
Gets increasingly awkward, yes, and falls out of favor. But it does take 20 years. So, it's a good run.
And, still have more sex, just in case.
Yeah. He was part of you can fix the problems by having more sex, guys.
Fixing the uterus, yeah.
Fixing the uterus. Anyway, so it all comes to the end. Uterus sort of dies out as the cause in the early 1900s when Sigmund Freud comes on board. So Sigmund,
bless him.
Yeah, bless him. He lives from 1865 to 1935. Obviously, he's had an enormous effect on the world psyche, basically. And he basically says that hysteria is due to a lack of libidinal evolution. Okay, so that's pretty much, great words. So basically what he means is it's your sexual development. So the development of yours. And out of this comes his famous Oedipus complex. The Oedipus complex is what you supposedly have around the age of 4 to 6. And it's this sexual desire. So it's psychoanalytic theory. We kind of turfed it all now. But this is where he's at. It's a sexual desire for involvement with the parent of the opposite sex and the sense of rivalry with the parent of the same sex. And he sees it as a crucial stage of the normal development process. And so the reason why it's called the Oedipus complex is because Oedipus is he's part of Greek mythology. And what he does is he kills his dad and he unawarely marries his mum. And so that's where that's at. And the female equivalent is then the Electra complex. And so Electra kills her mum and her mum's lover in revenge for murder of her father. So, dad was already gone.
Okay.
So they're the electric points. And he has a couple of other things that pretty much he's saying that it's the unconscious mind that is linked to hysteria. And what Freud does is Freud then links, and I think this is the major thing that I think is really interesting. So he then links the concept of secondary gain to hysterical symptoms. The whole idea then is that your primary gain in this setting is you release an unsatisfied sexual desires drive. So you get this symptom. Well, yeah, you get a symptom because you've got this, this unsatisfied sexual desire. And so that releases the energy that's taking place because of that. And then you get this secondary benefit by then being able to manipulate the environment to be able to meet your own needs. And so what he's done here within this environment or within this theory is that now he's linked mental illness and unexplained symptoms to secondary gain.
Yeah.
And so now
to the manipulation of that situation. And you create then the stereotype that is perpetuated. practically from then on. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, that's where I think that comes from. At least from my reading, it seems to be those linking together. And that's where we start to get this whole, building of mistrust, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And a pre-existing almost like warning on physicians' end of like, look out for patients who are like this. And then instead of giving the patient the benefit of the doubt, you're coming into it with this perspective of attaching attention seeking or medication seeking or whatever it may be, illness behavior.
Yeah. So we call them yellow flags these days.
Yeah,
and so
yellow.
Yellow flags. Like your red flags are patient going to die.
That's fair.
Yellow flags are, a lot of them are about secondary gain. And so just the link between these symptoms,
the behavior, the symptoms. Yeah.
So we'll jump a decade or so because we have the, Second World War, and you get to 1952 where the first Diagnostic Statistical Manual is released. And so this is I think it was 32 pages, something like that, ring bound. Yeah. Where what it does is it brings together a whole stack of diagnoses and then starts to categorize them under different things. One of the two important things they produce are conversion hysteria and psychophysiological autonomic and visceral disorders. So they're now starting to split up this. And so what they're saying here is that a conversion disorder is something that is experienced consciously, and it's a stimulus causing anxiety, is converted, inverted commas, converted into functional symptoms, mainly under voluntary control. Okay, and so that's important within this. So they're saying that this is
voluntary. It's even voluntary.
Well, no, it's part of the voluntary system.
Okay. It's not voluntary on the patient's part to produce.
Yeah. So they're splitting it out between autonomic and visceral symptoms and musculoskeletal symptoms, basically, is what they're doing here. And so such reactions usually meet immediate needs of the patient and are therefore associated with more or less secondary gain, goes straight into the DSM-4. Okay. Conversion reactions and conversion hysteria are considered the same. Okay. And so they also say in recording such reactions, the symptomatic manifestations will be specified as anesthesia. So we're sort of back at Briquette type stuff. So that's loss of smell, blindness, deafness, paralysis, which is paresis, unable to speak, aphonia, monoplegia, one arm, hemiplegia, one side of the body, dyskinesis. So tics fall into this, tremors, posturing, cataplexy. These are all neurological conditions. Okay. This is sort of like, and these are all under voluntary control. That's what they're trying to say. What they then do is they split out everything else into psychophysiological, autonomic, and visceral disorders. So everything else is then where you're getting dizziness, lightheadedness, GIT type symptoms fit into a different category. So what I did is I sat down, I went through the DSM-1 because I wanted to look at what were the things that they then categorized. So what was the symptom? And, do we have an explanation for it now? So let's go through and let's put this into a context, right? What they're saying is that we do not have a medical understanding or a medical cause for this. We are then going to categorize it into something else, which is then it's a mental disorder. And the DSM is like, it's a categorization of mental disorders. It is
mental disorders, right? So that would be logical.
Yeah. So the things that they link in are cramps, which goes under psychophysiological musculoskeletal, backache, psychophysiological musculoskeletal. And so, cramps is still a difficult mechanism. There's probably a couple of different mechanisms, but, ends up being an imbalance between muscle tension and length effectively. Backache, yes, you can break it down to facet, sacroiliac joint, hip disc nerve. Bronchial spasm comes under psychophysiological. So that's now asthma, which is an immune disorder.
Right.
Hiccups also goes under a respiratory reaction. Paroxysmal tachycardia. Okay, so that's probably going into the POTS realm these days, which is like dysautonomia. So that fits in.
Yes.
Interestingly, hypertension is psychophysiological cardiovascular.
Such a good example of how a view has changed on something.
Yeah. Migraine at that point in
Nice.
time sat under the cardiovascular reaction, which is kind of interesting.
Really? Like blood vessels in the head.
Yeah, maybe it was because that was thought it was that. Interestingly, peptic ulcer-like reaction. So peptic ulcer disease, chronic gastritis, heartburn. That's in the psychogenic gastroenteritis. Well, like it did take some time, but that's an infection now. So that's H. pylori. It did take to the late 80s, early 90s. And I remember reading, I was doing a science degree during the early 90s, and like the whole acid reflux, that was all still in the textbooks as what the cause was. It was sort of at about that time that the H. pylori thing came through, thanks to some, well, it's basically to the Western Australian guy who basically went, hang on.
Nice.
He infected himself with it. He gave it to himself.
Really?
Basically, I think the way it
Ballsy.
goes, I'm not 100% sure of the diagnosis, but basically what he did is he identified that there was H. pylori in the bottom of all these ulcers. He went back and looked at some other ulcer, like, because we cut out so many stomachs over the years, there was all these samples of stomach. So he went back and looked at those and went, hey, there's H. pylori here. And he was like, hey, this is an infection. Everyone's going, dude, you're crazy.
You're crazy.
And he goes, okay, I'll prove it to you. So he gave it to himself. So he infected himself with H. pylori, got an ulcer, and like, see, told you. And then that's where we're at. Other things. So ulcerative colitis. Okay, now it's an autoimmune disorder. Irritable bowel syndrome, mucus colitis. That sits in there. Constipation, dysmenorrhea, so painful periods. That's psychophysiological genitourinary metorrhagia. So interperiod bleeding. I don't even know how you get to that. Pain during intercourse. That's a psychophysiological thing.
Yeah, not because of a tight pelvic floor.
With my explanation on that, I just wrote WTF.
Dan's document has a couple WTFs on it.
Amenorrhea, so no periods. Right. Parturition post-psychology. So that's having a baby post a psychological trauma. Maybe that's...
to cure, make a trauma better.
I think it's a trauma that triggers off parturition, like having the baby. So... I think maybe that kind of fits in there. You can kind of sort of fit into that.
Yeah, I was like, is it a trauma response in some
way? Yeah, trauma response. That's what they argued. Anosmia, that's a conversion disorder now, which is interesting. So like everybody with COVID, you've just got a conversion disorder.
Yeah.
Is the way it would have been diagnosed. And you want to sort of how many versions of other viruses have been capable of causing
that type of output, like dysautonomia and those sort of symptoms that then you're like, what the hell?
Yeah. Paresthesia, so it's like weird sensations. Incontinence. So that was also a conversion disorder. Asanopia. So asanopia is eye strain. So us sitting here looking at the screen.
Staring at the screen 20 hours.
For 20 hours, yes. So that's eye strain. And I think in the way they describe it as well, it also sounds like dry eyes. So dry eyes at least it's an aqueous or lipid layer disorder. It's also tied in with central sensitization. One of my favorites was lazy eye. So amblyopia. Is a conversion disorder. And so, that's now linked to both, changes in color perception or contrast perception and cortical changes. And so what's interesting about this whole list, and without, going through it lists a ton, like it's not just, okay, here's one type of symptom. It's like tons of symptoms. It's everything that we don't understand is now a psychophysiological reaction or it's conversion disorder. It's a release of underlying anxiety. When you then start to tie these things together, and so this is sort of when starting to understand this, they've made a broad range of symptoms, mental disorders, but as a part of that, they've linked these broad range of symptoms to secondary gain. And so now what that generates...
Right.
So that anybody who comes in with
these
symptoms that are vague, there's no explanation.
It's not on scans.
It's now a mental disorder, and it's because of secondary, and there's this whole secondary gain. So it creates this whole suspicion that exists behind it. Yeah. And it's kind of like, okay, you can kind of see, and I think it's like, if you read through the DSM-1, like it's very clear that what they're trying to do, and they very much state it, we're going to categorize this. It allows us to put things into, categories to allow more research to better understand and then go on and change it. And that's what they've done. Like, to be fair, DSM-1 has gone through multiple changes and tons of research, and it still takes place. Like, there's been 8 different versions of it now, whether it be like we're up to DSM-5, but they have a couple of transitions in between. So you get a DSM-3R, which is just a rewrite of some of the bits, not all of the bits. And if you look at the literature now, like with looking at DSM-5, like you read the literature and there's a whole stack of criticisms of it. Okay, this doesn't work, this does work, blah, 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 blah. This needs to be changed, that needs to be changed. So when we get the DSM-5R, I assume what we're going to see is we're going to see a bunch of changes. So the process, I think, is valid.
In the right direction.
It's going in the right direction, but it's had these unintended consequences for patients. And so that's where
that's the disconnect.
That's the disconnect. That's the disconnect. I think there's good intention, but there's unintended consequences. What the medical fraternity are doing, particularly the psychiatric fraternity, is they're trying to categorize unexplained symptoms and presentations so that there's a way to go about treating it. And it creates a way to understand it, although sometimes there's unintended consequences. And here's one unintended consequence. So I took this off Florida State College website, 2009, and it's a lecture on somatoform disorders. Okay, so basically from DSM-1, then 2, a couple of changes, and then we go into DSM-3. That's when somatoform disorders are described. And somatoform disorders, what they are is essentially the physical presentation of an underlying psychiatric issue, and they're then split into multiple different things. So somatization disorder. So somatization disorders, it gets mentioned in DSM-1, but it really comes to the fore in 3. And then you have conversion disorder, hypochondriasis, pain disorders, body dysmorphic syndrome, factitious disorder, and then malingering. Okay. And so they all sit under somatoform disorders. And now we're sort of talking a little bit about DSM-4 as well. So, and here's one of the unintended consequences. Okay. At the top of this lecture, and this is a table I'm looking at, or it's a kind of a diagram that I'm looking at, it states, never refer these patients. Do not tell the patient that nothing is wrong with them. Okay.
Exclamation point. Exclamation point. In all caps.
In all caps. Yeah. Like, and so one of the criticisms of this model is that you do have underlying diagnoses and stuff gets missed and stuff progresses that you should have picked up.
Yeah. Or someone else should have picked up.
Someone else should be. Yeah. And it's interesting that, like, for me, they never refer these patients. I'm like, whoa.
Scary. It's like closing off care.
Yeah. And I don't know where that comes from. I don't know whether
I think it's the wasting resources piece to a degree a bit. Like it's
maybe.
It's not necessary.
And who even knows if that's actually valid amongst, or even if it was valid amongst the psychiatric or psychological fraternity during that period of time. But it's certainly an interesting perspective. We'll just speak a little bit about a couple of them. So somatoform disorders, as I said, they're split into a number of different things. The first thing it's split into is somatization disorder. And so at this point in time, DSM-3 also referred to itself as DSM-3 somatoform disorders / Briquette syndrome. And you can see that Briquette syndrome comes through within this. The diagnostic criteria, where you had to have pain at 4 sites or over 4 functional areas. So it had to be head, back, joints, extremities, chest, blah, blah, blah. Pain during intercourse during that period of time, or pain during urination. Like, okay, you had to have at least 2 GIT symptoms. So nausea, bloating, vomiting other than during pregnancy, diarrhea, or intolerance of several different foods. Ooh.
Yeah, I was going to say food intolerances have got to be in here.
So, yeah. So the pain stuff, now we're saying, well, that probably sounds like fibro. Now we'd go, that's nosoplastic pain. And if it's over multiple sites, it's fibro. And if it's regional, well, it's a regional pain disorder that brings you into the temporal mandibular joint pain, etc. Right. Your GI symptoms, like, let's go, that just sounds like irritable bowel syndrome. You've got to have 1 sexual symptom. So sexual indifference.
Well, yes, output.
Well, that's a bit hard. Yeah. Erectile or ejaculative dysfunction, Irregular menses. That's the metorrhagia
amenorrhea.
from excessive menstrual bleeding. Like, how is this a psychological disorder?
Right. Like, how can you,
how, like,
bizarre.
and vomiting throughout pregnancy. Well, how's that?
It's one thing if
like,
during pregnancy. Yeah.
Like, you're only allowed to vomit for the first 3 months. After that, you have to stop, or that's in your head.
God, I mean, this was me the 9 years after the brain injury. And I think if I looked back on my medical records, I would bet my bottom dollar I have somatoform disorder on it.
Oh, yeah.
Because
absolutely.
I was to a T this type of presentation. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why it makes my skin crawl, and it's painful, but it's really important to talk through it, because then you can see like how.
Yeah, well, you can see how then,
Absurd,
doctors go. So the way I would, when I know less, I defer my knowledge to what's on the page and what people that are like super smart at and organizations like DSM, you defer to that. You say, well, I don't know.
Right.
What do these guys say? And like that's really the basis of nearly everything. And you've got to have one pseudo-neurological symptom. So impaired coordination, that's a bit harsh, paralysis or localized weakness, difficulty swallowing or lump in the throat. So that's called, like back in the day, that was called globus hystericus, aphonia, urinary retention. And once again, I don't get it. Hallucinations. Well, hallucinations are moving across into schizophrenia.
It's like a med side effect.
Loss of touch or pain sensation, double vision, blindness, deafness, seizures, dissociative symptoms such as amnesia or loss of consciousness other than fainting. Okay, so there's a mix in there of conversion disorder stuff, like, or what we're now referring to as functional neurological disorders, and other stuff like double vision. I think it's a bit hard, but there's certainly medical disorders within that you would go.
Once you get flagged, but once you get flagged as somatism, I can't say that, Jesus, disorder, those, don't get as examined.
Yeah. It's got to be not due to a medical disorder. It's got to be not due to some substance abuse. And I think the interesting thing that they'd call it is that symptoms are in excess of what would be expected. Query, are they amplified? And so I think, so what you've got, that actually makes sense from that sort of perspective. And now we're sort of going down the track of, well, this is sensitization, which would be how we would.
Persistent symptom, patient is going to persistently complain and attention seek to address it.
Yeah. So then you've got conversion disorders, which, as we discussed, this is more a neurological presentation. It's either sensory or motor function, inconsistent with no neurological disorders that have no other medical condition and significantly impact on the patient. Next component is then hypochondriasis. So hypochondriasis is, it's a preoccupation and fears of having, or the idea that one has a serious disease based on the person's misinterpretation of body symptoms, despite appropriate medical evaluation and reassurance. And so this has changed. So in DSM-5, that's now illness anxiety disorder. And so that's where you don't have that many symptoms, but you're really anxious that you've got a whole bunch of stuff going on. Okay.
Very convinced.
There you go. That's actually an anxiety disorder, and that, I can get no problems. And taking out the word hypochondriasis, which has got so much negative in terms, I used the hypochondriac. What that does is it shifts it to a focus on the anxiety, and then you can go on and then manage that. And so you look at CBT. CBT is a great way of treating anxiety related to that stuff. But it's most importantly, it's a group of patients that have minimal symptoms.
Well, and that's fair and an appropriate thing to treat, because whether or not the patient is valid in having that anxiety, it's intrusive to their life. It's negatively impacting them, even if you can say, I understand why you have that anxiety, but hey, let's make it less intense. So it's not terrible.
There's also psychogenic pain disorder. That's DSM-3 and 4. So that's severe, prolonged pain that is the predominant disturbance. The pain is presented as a symptom, is inconsistent with anatomical distribution of the nervous system. After extensive evaluation, no organic pathology or pathophysiological mechanism can be found to account for the pain, or when there is some related organic pathology, the complaint of pain is grossly in excess of what would be expected from physiological findings. And so,
which is super consistent with sensitization.
Yeah,
and then the output and the behavior of the patient is equally as disproportionate as the symptom.
And psychological factors are judged to be etiologically involved in the pain as evidenced by at least one of the following, which I didn't cover across. But pretty much what they're saying is that, and you can see where this comes at the moment, the patient comes in with anxiety and depression. And so you automatically go to the anxiety and depression as the cause of
rather than outputs.
Yes.
Yeah.
When we talk about it, we see the anxiety and depression as a consequence with a positive feedback loop that worsens, but is not the cause.
Right. It doesn't mean it doesn't make pain worse. It does, but it's not why you have pain.
Right? The other two components, factitious disorder, that's a process where you make yourself sick to gain access to medical care. So you're not trying to like get out of other stuff, but
you just want medical care.
You want medical care. And there's a whole stack of other stuff behind that. And then the last piece is malingering. And so what you're doing is you're actually either creating symptoms or exacerbating symptoms to get out of doing stuff. So the example there is people that want to get out of being like drafted to the army or, you know, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Some responsibility you don't want.
Yeah. But where I suppose we most see it at this point in time is with going back to work. So where people get accused of being malingerers because they've got excessive pain because they're sensitized.
Yeah.
And so that's where all that.
Yeah, this is really tough with CRPS patients, right? You're forced to go back to work. You can't get disability because you're viewed as there's nothing really that wrong with you. And if there is, it's because it's your fault. And you can get better if you want to, which is actually a common attitude in other countries with these types of disorders too.
Yeah. So you can kind of see all that sort of stuff. And then when you move into DSM-5, DSM-5 changes somatoform disorders and somatization disorder to be somatic symptom disorder. Now, we were talking about this before. So what it is excessive thoughts, feelings, or behaviors related to somatic symptoms or associated with health concerns as manifested by one of the following. Disproportionate and persistent thoughts are about the seriousness of one's symptoms, persistent high level of anxiety about health symptoms, excessive time and energy are devoted to the symptoms or health concerns. To meet the criteria, you've got to have one or more somatic symptom that are distressing or results in significant disruption of life, and it has to be longer than 6 months. And there's a set of criteria that allow it to be categorized into mild, moderate, and severe. That stuff becomes really interesting. And there's two ways to read it. And this is sort of what we were discussing before. So
weird.
We talked about this, and I had read this as, okay, DSM-5 has shifted it to a focus on the response to the symptoms. So it's not the symptoms, it's the response to the symptoms. And so that seems reasonable. I think anybody that gets injured, you get worried that this is going to last a long period of time. Like I was chatting to one of my pain physician friends, and he, like me, like he fights like I do, and because we're both stupid, but like he got injured, and he said to me, I was fascinated how quickly my mind went to, is this going to go away?
Right.
Am I going to be able to train again? Like, what's this going to stop me doing? And so it's actually like, it's a normal response.
Right.
And so I think that it's the excessive component to it that is what the disorder is.
Prolonged.
Is prolonged. And the other thing, it's disproportionate and it's prolonged, which
familiar.
Sounds familiar. That's central sensitization. So like whether you have, a response to pain on palpation, which is disproportionate and prolonged, whether you have sleep disturbance, which is disproportionate, whether you have, brain fog, whether you have anxiety that is disproportionate, your
fatigue,
your worry about what's going to happen with this becomes disproportionate and prolonged. And that's where somatic symptom disorder comes in. However, you could also read this in a slightly different way, is that it's actually, because it's moved the focus from being you've got to have 4 pain symptoms and 2 GIT to this, so it just has to be 1 or more symptoms. Like I had read that as, well, you don't have, like the symptom is just part of the condition. It's not a mentally generated, it's not a psychogenic symptom.
Right.
However, you could read that as, well, you no longer have to have these, these 4 criteria, 4 pain, 2 GIT, 1 sexual, 1 pseudo-neurologic. Now you can have anything that results.
Perfect.
And it also just needs to be medically unexplained. And that's
Right.
interesting. And so there was a rebuttal that I saw that reads like, in the new DSM-5, somatic symptom disorder over psychologicalizes people with chronic pain. It has low sensitivity and specificity, and it contributes to misdiagnosis as well as unnecessary stigma. I like this last one. Adjustment disorder remains the most appropriate, accurate, acceptable diagnosis for people who are overly concerned about their pain. Oh, boom. Drop mic, walk out. So
you're struggling to adjust. You can't adjust. Like that's you can. It's really hard.
Like that makes a ton of like that response. I really like, and it's part of the interpretation. I had it interpreted the somatic symptom disorder in that way, as it like now it's any symptom you like.
Yeah, I don't love that.
Just as long as you got it for more than 6 months, which is is what that rebuttle's about.
I mean, it's like very unnerving. For example, if you have a long-term set of symptom or many, if the people that are supposed to explain it can't, that doesn't make you feel better. It makes you feel worse. So what other response, could you really reasonably had? And then a synonym for how you do or don't deal with that is like, it's a coping disorder.
Yeah. Oh, and just to we'll finish off this a little bit. So conversion disorders are now being dropped, and they're now functional neurological disorders. And I think the most important part of that is that it is very much focused on neurological disorders. It remains part of the motor or sensory function, but it's very much like it's hived it off into functional neurological disorders, not conversion disorder, which where it started at was like all manner of, crazy stuff. So it's really shrunk it down in, conversion disorder back in DSM-1 included stuff broad. Like, incontinence. All right, great. Right. Not very useful. And it's now down to, neurological disorders, which makes more sense.
Better. Yeah. And I think what's hard about the somatic symptom disorder definition is like at the beginning when we talked about it requires a certain amount of humility to say, I don't know. This is a perfect example of instead of saying, I don't know, it's medicine can't explain it. So there's something wrong with you.
Yeah. Yeah. And look, and I think it all depends on how you interpret it. Like if you interpret it as the second line being, it includes the symptom, like includes the symptom as being what is
persistent.
Well, what is mental? If you do not include the symptom, you just include the response to the symptom. Right. Well, I think that's the behavioral response to the symptom. I think that's reasonable. I'm not sure how it was meant to be. So maybe I'll ask one of my psychiatric friends about what was meant. Within categorization of things as well, we've now sort of moved. So there's DSM-4 that does all, and DSM-5 that does all that, all those sort of things. And then there's the classification of diseases. That's ICD's International Classification of Diseases. It's up to volume 11 now. They, quite reasonably they define things as either a primary disorder or it's secondary pain syndrome. So primary pain disorders are considered disease of the nervous system, which includes chronic wave-said pain, complex regional pain syndrome, chronic primary headache, orofacial pain, chronic primary visceral pain, and chronic musculoskeletal pain. So there's no statement there about it's in your head. They're just saying it's a nervous system disorder. And then chronic secondary pain syndrome is as a result of stuff. So includes chronic cancer pain, chronic neuropathic pain, which doesn't make sense. Seeing neuropathic pain is an injury of the nervous system should probably go in the first category. Right. Chronic secondary visceral pain, chronic post-traumatic and post-surgical pain, and chronic secondary musculoskeletal pain, so post-injury stuff. So like that stuff makes sense. As how useful it is, I don't know, not very, but, puts it into categories and, doesn't put it in your head. Right.
Such. At least it's a disease of the nervous system rather than a disease of your mind or of your brain.
And I suppose that sort of brings us through the whole history of like where we are. And so, how do you, we've spent, it's like 8 months now working through how do you generate a system that does a number of things. So number one, you have to have a way that you can think through these things. Patients are super complex. Everyone wiggle and get down on the ground. Judges, better wrap this up. We're talking too long.
This is a good one. I mean, to have the whole lineage of perspective is helpful. It's neat.
So you got to have a way to think about this. Like at this point in time, when patients come in, we've sort of moved to, well, you're centrally sensitized. That is,
yes.
That's the new somatoform disorder, kind of.
And at least we say neuroinflammation.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like
you're centrally sensitized, but it also ends like with get out.
Yeah, bye.
Or you've got fibromyalgia. And so we need to move beyond that. And so we need a thinking tool that you can work through. So what we've developed is a process where you start to break down sensitization into 6 components. So you've got sensory hypersensitivity, which includes sensitivity to pain, light, sound, touch, taste, heat, cold, balance, food. You've then got sleep disturbance and fatigue. You've got brain fog or cognitive dysfunction, which is then memory, cognition, thinking. You've got mood disturbance. So you've got depression, anxiety.
Stress goes under there even.
Stress goes underneath there. Probably somatic symptom disorder, if you're nice to it, goes underneath there. Dysautonomia. So dysautonomia is being orthostatic intolerance. So lightheadedness, dizziness, tachycardia, an extreme end of that. POTS. You've got your GIT symptoms, which then includes your IBS type diagnoses. You've got genitourinary symptoms, which then is your bladder pain syndrome / interstitial cystitis. So you get frequency, urgency, incomplete emptying.
Would neurogenic bladder go under there? Because that's pretty common. Yeah, just a side thought in our population.
Yeah. Depends on what you describe. The definition of neurogenic bladder. I haven't sat down and really looked through it. One of the downsides of me is I do arms, legs, and backs, not bladders that often. As I learn, I need to expand out my knowledge base.
You don't want to be back, neck, joint, and bladder.
Yeah, no. And then you've got sexual dysfunction that tacks on the end, which we really haven't talked about much, but it certainly sits in under those dysautonomias. And then the final component is then motor dysfunction. So motor dysfunction probably sits into cramps, restless leg syndrome, maybe some of the dystonias, and then functional inhibition or pain inhibition takes place.
Hence my squirming. That's an inhibition, weakness, motor. This is motor issues.
So that's a thinking tool. You can ask a history, you can do some surveys, you can pull out a patient's, what is it, what symptoms they have, and then the ability to then have, an approach that then gives you first line conservative management, investigation of that in a logical fashion that doesn't go through the process of like spending tens of thousands of dollars, which is easy to do.
Well, and especially when you don't have a plan, then you will spend tens of thousands of dollars. So to cut down on the resource wastage, you have to have a better way to approach it.
And then stepping into third line management, which will then be medications and then interventional stuff after that. And so, this has been an 8-month process so far. It'll be multiple years by the time it's actually fully formed. But I think that it does bring together the, I don't know, but this is how we're going to work it out.
Right.
It doesn't dismiss the psychological components. It doesn't dismiss the fact that this makes you anxious. It makes you depressed. Yeah. It makes you focus on what the hell is going to happen with my life if I don't sort this stuff out. All of which, I kind of think that if you are not depressed and if you're not anxious, you're not normal.
No, you're not in that much pain. I don't mean to judge other people's situations, but it's that's part of when it goes on and on a long time too. You get more of that desperation. And
I hope that how we're going to work through this essentially builds on the century of neuroscience, the century of torturing, little mice, rats, guinea pigs, whatever we've tortured to get our science behind it.
Do it justice.
It builds on what people like Briquette identified. And hopefully what we see as well is that it cuts some of the unintended consequences. It cuts the blame that this is in your head and the sense of shame that comes with that and the sense of helplessness. But it does not also ignore the fact that you've got to deal with the anxiety and depression that comes about because of this stuff. And by treating that, we know that does help symptoms because it takes out one of the amplifiers.
Something it's bringing that overall output down, just like you would want to then be able to better find, all right, what other things, what are the real causes, right? Rather than a output that's also creating that amplification. So I think if you can increase empathy from the patient perspective, right, and kind of understand how have we gotten into this position to a degree, it's not because physicians don't care, it's because they don't want to hurt you. And there's a lot of inherent limitations in the system and with their own knowledge. And even when you reach your limit, it doesn't mean ignorance. Sometimes it's an appropriate reaching of limits. And then that's where we want to come in and add something that physicians and other practitioners can use to fill in that space with something a lot better than, since I don't know, it's on you, it's in your head, fill it in.
Yeah, please leave.
Because this is what causes the misunderstanding and the miscommunication and the frustration on both sides. And I think it could be improved. So
yeah.
That's
and
what
look, and it's the same.
do.
And I think that as we started with the sole focus on chasing down pathology and investigation results in, mistrust, fear, blame, and not recognizing that there's a central neurological process, and blaming the mind results in mistrust, blame.
And you don't solve the problem.
And you don't solve the problem.
So we hope that gives you some good insight and historical perspective on where some of these attitudes come from. This was a really, really fun and important episode. And I really appreciate Dan combing through some of these wild papers too, to put together this outline that really takes you through witchcraft to, what are we at? Neuroinflammation.
There you go. All right.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
All right. Thanks. See ya. Thanks for listening. Clearly, this is a podcast. It's for informational purposes. It's not consult, medical advice, or the practice of medicine, and it doesn't form a therapeutic relationship. If you feel the information might be useful for your situation, before applying it to yourself or others, you should speak with your doctor or your treating clinician. Do not delay in seeking a diagnosis or treatment, and applying the information is at the listener's own risk.